Welcome to the Fast Leader Podcast, where we explore convenient yet effective shortcuts that will help you get ahead and move forward faster by becoming a better leader. And now, here's your host, customer and employee engagement expert and certified emotional intelligence practitioner, Jim Rembach.
Call Center Coach develops and unites the next generation of call center leaders. Through our e-learning and community, individuals gain knowledge and skills in the 6 core competencies that is the blueprint that develops high-performing call center leaders. Successful supervisors do not just happen. So go to callcentercoach.com to learn more about enrollment and download your copy of the Supervisor Success Path ebook now. Okay, Fast Leader Legion. Today, I'm thrilled because I have somebody on the show who's really going to help us address something that I think many of us, if not all of us, have some fear in. Ed Muzio has bounced around the country quite a bit. He was born in New York and grew up in New Mexico, attended university back east at Cornell, and after his career took him to Phoenix, Portland, Santa Clara, back to Albuquerque, and twice to Austin, he stayed there, which is where he lives now with his wife and little boy. Ed was raised by an entrepreneur father and a teacher mother. As a kid, he helped mom prepare her classroom and teaching materials, and he also helped dad run his business and keep things moving productively from food service to finance. Of course, nobody starts out consulting. Ed's first gig lasted nearly a decade working for Intel during a technology boom that created hyper growth in the company and the industry. With his engineering degree, Ed started off in a technical role for high volume manufacturing. But he pretty quickly realized that as engineers go, he was a little different. He seemed to always be the one in the room paying attention to things like the structure of the meeting, the use of authority, and the effectiveness of communication. Luckily, hypergrowth creates a lot of opportunity, and Ed found ways to bring those talents to Intel's growth even as his technical career grew. Along the way, he connected with and learned from the internal and external experts who were supporting Intel's unique form of high-functioning management. Then in the early 2000s, he ventured out on his own and founded Group Harmonics. Today, having run his firm for nearly 15 years, Ed said that his newest book may be his best professional legacy so far. Iterate is based not only on lessons learned in and out of Intel, but also on the background work of Ed's mentor, Bill Daniels, who consulted for decades to Intel and other high-growth companies. Ed Muzio, are you ready to help us get over the hump?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
I'm glad you're here too. Now, I've given my Legion a little bit about you, but can you tell us what your current passion is so that we can get to know you even better?
You know, current passions float around, but one of the things I'm doing on the side that nobody knows about is I'm learning to play piano right now. And I'm doing that because my 6-year-old son is learning to play piano, and I've always wanted to learn. And I thought, why not? So I tag on the end of his lesson. His instructor gives me 15 minutes of coaching, and then I practice every day. And it's been a good reminder in how the human brain works. It's good for my instructional designs and my corporate work as well, because it's sort of a real life reminder of what it's like to learn something when you just don't know what you're doing. And that's useful in this business.
You know, I'm glad you shared that. I mean, and as you were talking, I started thinking about, you know, your book and talking about this, you know, being more iterative, and we're going to get into that in a second. But I'm curious to know, because we talk about it's easier to learn a language when you're young. It's easier to do this when you're young. Do you see a big difference in your ability to learn the piano at your age versus your son at his age?
You know, I've thought a lot about that. I thought about it before I started, and being an instructional designer in some ways, I've thought a lot about that as I'm going along. And I think the answer is yes and no. I think it's easier for him because he doesn't have any of the extra cognitive baggage around making mistakes or around falling down, around having to try new things. The part that's easier for me is I can take inbound communication in more complex forms. So I'm conceptually ahead of him, and therefore, for a while, I'm technically ahead of him, meaning I'm ahead of him on the keyboard. But I can already see it's about, I'm guessing a year and a half away, he's going to pass me. And when he passes me, I'm not going to catch up. He has more time, he has more energy, but also it's going to be kind of second nature to him in a way that it won't ever be to me. What's been interesting, though, is kind of watching the learning curve for me, which is it's iteration, right? It's like you have to keep doing it and trying and adjusting until finally something becomes second nature enough that you get more mental calories to do something else. It's actually a concept we talk about in management, but it's been fun to watch that, where it's like now there are certain chords I can play while my brain is looking at what's next, whereas it used to be it took all my attention to play that chord, and that makes a big difference in how I can sort of proceed through some simple music. So it's been an experience.
Well, and I think that's really helpful to also kind of set up what you have as your definition of iterate, because I love the way you ended it. And I'm going to read this real quick from the book. It says, iterate is to take the most logical step from where you are and then do it again and again. Iteration is how computers simulate complex systems. It's how humankind got from the Wright Flyer to the Boeing 747. And it's how you walk to your car.
It is probably the most boring analogy ever, but I always talk about that. You walk out the door of the mall or the office building and you look at your watch and you say, I got to get to my car in, less than 3 minutes to stay on time. And then you look across the parking lot and you can't see your car and you're not sure where it is. You start walking. The whole time you're walking, you've got information flowing down from the executive office saying, get there by this time. You've got your feet detecting irregularities in the surface, feeding information up. But this whole system, middle management, cardiovascular, the whole system is really just optimized around one thing, which is take a step and then learn from it. So if things are more slippery than you thought, if you notice it's the wrong car, up, top down, bottom up, whatever, every step leads to information and the information gets fed into the next step. And that's the key that is often the difference between computer modeling and company, corporate work, which is if we set a plan in January and just blindly follow it and don't adjust, we're in trouble by June, no matter what. Every step we take is information. The trick is how do we incorporate that information back into the next step? And that's, in the book, that's management's job, is to make sure the organization is incorporating that and adjusting.
Well, and I think the nuance of all of that is leading the people along the way. You don't manage them, you actually lead them, but you're managing the process. And
right.
So when you start talking about there's 5 key management practices, and that's output and status broadcasting, work preview meetings, group discussion making, linked teams, and then frontline self-sufficiency. So when you start thinking about these 5 key management steps, how did you actually come about structuring them in this way, and how can it be an iterative or an adapted process for an organization that's, say, not like an Intel and in manufacturing?
Right. Well, the concepts work in a variety of scenarios, but let me answer your first question first, which is you pointed to a very interesting topic, which is how do you structure this in a way that you can talk about it? In reality, those 5 practices are interdependent. In the same way we talk about people in the workplace are interdependent. They are neither independent, they can't work alone, nor should they ever be fully dependent, right? So those 5 practices depend on each other. And so even just the logistics of how do I get through a book, which is essentially linear, right, front to back, and explain something when thing number 1 that I'm explaining depends on thing number 5 that I haven't explained yet. And so to a certain extent, the order that you get in the book is a little artificial, because by the time you get to the end, you realize you couldn't have done the first thing without the last thing either. But as you're reading, you have to understand a piece at a time. And so we start with the output and status broadcasting because that's a clear place to start, to say, look, if you don't have a clear goal and you're not measuring your goal in a forward-looking way to where you can say, what do I think is going to happen in the future? Then it's hard to think about making adjustments. It's hard to think about making good group decisions or, having your teams connect together the right way, because what are you heading for? So in that regard, we start with goals. Then we get into, okay, now that you have a goal, how do you meet about it? Now that you're in a meeting, how do you make your decisions? Now that you're making decisions in meetings, let's talk about how that team making decisions interacts with another team making decisions. And then when we get all done with that, we get to frontline self-sufficiency, which is now that you've got all these managers running around making decisions based on forecasts, let's talk for a minute about the people actually doing your work in the organization and how do they know what's going to happen? Because if they can't make good forecasts, then, the rest of it sort of doesn't matter. So there is a linear progression, but in reality, they all support each other.
You bring up a good point, and this kind of reminds me of a guest that I had previously that talked about ecosystems, is you kind of have to know your, iteration or iterative ecosystem.
It is. It's a system of practices, and we talk about that just in the same way that your body walking to the car is a system of components, right? This is a system of practices, and the truth is, if you're in an organization that's functioning relatively well, you're probably doing some of these things. One of the tricks, the other challenges in this work, which is probably important to mention here, is language. So there's a whole issue around, if I talk about something called, let's say, pragmatic dashboards, which is a label that I have. As soon as someone hears the word dashboard, they go, well, I know what a dashboard is. I'll skip this part. But it might not be the behavior I'm talking about. So I sort of beg people in the book to go, just pretend you don't know what the words mean for long enough to figure out if the behavior I'm describing is or isn't going on, because I don't have an egotistical need for you to call the behavior the same thing. I just want you to understand that if that behavior isn't happening, you may have a gap that you can improve upon. That's really the important thing.
Well, another thing for me is I was looking through the book, it just kind of stood out. I mean, to me, it wasn't one of those things that was blaring, but for me, it just seemed to be so darn important, and I wanted us to talk about it. And you talked about task types, and that task types really matter when you start going through your iterative and iteration type of, process or system or ecosystem. And you talk about predictability, delay tolerance, and you talked about these three different types of tasks. I mean, tell us how they may have an impact or effect.
So it turns out that issue of task type you're absolutely right. It's important in a couple different ways to management. One of them is, as I just mentioned, there's some specific information we have about how you should be looking forward in terms of what's going to happen with your work. So if you've decided to, whether it's produce something, on a certain schedule or whatever, you want to have data and information that allows you to get with the management team and say, here's what the future looks like. Here's what we thought it was going to look like. Here's what it looks like now. Here's how it is or isn't different. If it isn't different, there's nothing to talk about. Let's not talk about it. If it is different, that's a variance. And do we need to address it? Because if we're going to get somewhere different than we thought, how does that affect the work of my peers? How does that affect my boss's work, et cetera? So in order to do that, you do have to get a clear understanding of those three task types. And so there are three. The first one is routine work. That's like factory production, or, a simple example is imagine having a pile of papers to sign, and you're going to sign each one because you're in a bureaucratic sense, you're the approver on these papers. That's a simple example of routine work. There's a pile of work. It's low delay tolerance, meaning it needs to be done pretty fast once you get the work, but it's high predictability. You know exactly what the work is. The 100th unit you make in the factory is the same as the 10th, right? So that's routine. The second one is, we call it troubleshooting work. And that is the sort of, imagine the IT guy who's sitting at his desk and the phone rings, and he doesn't know what the work is until the phone rings and someone gives him the problem, right? So you call up and say, I'm blue screen, and that's the beginning of the problem, right? So that's characterized by high or low delay tolerance, again, which means once he has the problem, he has to solve it. But it's also low in predictability because you don't know what you have, you don't know what the work is. You can't anticipate it in the same way you can, factory production. And so that's the second one. The third one is project work, and this is where when delay tolerance goes down, goes up, meaning that you can wait a little longer, everything sort of becomes a project, right? Whether I'm, putting up an overpass 5 years from now, whether I'm launching a product in 6 months, my delay tolerance is allowing me to wait a little longer. And so that moves into a third flavor of work. So those are the flavors. And then I guess you probably want me to talk about how they relate to the iterative management. Is that what you're asking? Okay, so let's talk about that data display, right? The way you would display forward-looking information for factory production, let's say, is pretty straightforward. I can count how many I made this week. I can count how many I made last week. That's history. And then I can have a plan. This is how many I'm planning to make each week. And then I can have a forecast, which is, now that I know something about my resources, here's what I think I'll actually be able to do. And here's how it's different or not different from the plan. So that's a forward-looking forecast. And then we can see variance, right? So that model works really well for routine work. But if you give that graph to a guy doing troubleshooting, he'll say, this doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know what I'm going to have on my plate. I have no plan line. I'm just waiting for the phone to ring, right? So in troubleshooting work, it usually looks something more like queue lists, like how many issues have I received that I haven't even solved yet? I don't even know what the problem is. How many issues do I have in queue that I've solved the issue, but I haven't deployed or done the fix? And how many things do I have in my queue that are done? Right. And so if I start to have those three, imagine them almost like piles on my desk or sticky notes on the wall, right? If I do that for a while, a couple weeks, couple months, I start to understand what a fair day work looks like, right? What I can get done. And so if all of a sudden I come in one day and my unsolved is 3 times longer, I can say to my boss, look, I don't know for sure, but my experience suggests I'm behind, right? So again, that's that forward look. Am I going to stay on my track or not? Probably not in this case, right? So that's troubleshooting. The third one is project, and this is where I can get myself in a little trouble with the Project Management Institute if I'm not careful here. But there's a whole body of work, and very good work, by the way, around how to track and manage projects. But much of it is missing that critical forward look, which is to say, I don't care as much in management whether or not what I've done so far has met schedule. What I care about is I have a set of future milestones, and if Jim and I work on the same team, and Jim is watching me, because when I hit a certain milestone, he's going to use that work to hit his milestone, then what everybody cares about is, am I going to hit that milestone when I said? Not the one in the past, the one in the future. So, the history of whether I tend to hit my milestones, that's mildly interesting, because if I tend to miss, that gives you an idea. But anything else I can do to put in place to say, how can I look ahead and say, what's my actual likelihood of really hitting that or not? And again, what's the difference between what I said I would do and what I now think I would do? That's the kind of data displays we want to have for projects. And so that's why there's those appendices at the end of Iterate with examples of how to graph these things, because it turns out it's not that hard once you have the framework. But if you don't think through it in terms of task type, as you pointed out, then you end up looking at a graph of production going, this doesn't apply to me, and kind of walking away from it. So you've got to really segment before you start thinking about how to display and talk about your output.
Great insight. In addition, one of the things that you've done on the book, which I really like as a complementary aspect to it, is that people can get access to some videos where I'm sure you explain many of these things. But when you started talking through that particular example, I also started seeing how there was really a multitude of different people that would potentially be involved with some of that. Because if I'm in a contact center, whether it's customer service or support, and I'm handling all of those interactions, a lot of that data has to be fed back into the whole predictability and staff modeling component, right? How long does it take for you to do certain tasks and this, that, and the other, so that I can project how many people I need, and I can look at down the road, potential additional workload that may come and how many people, and it's talking about an iterative process that's fed with a lot of data. But
Right.
then also have that I need to, potentially have some project teams that are getting fed data because we have some systemic problems that we keep taking interactions and tasks and requests for that, we could eliminate.
Well, I think so. I think the thing to watch out for, though, and this is really a hard one. So I'm appreciating this interview because we're really deep in it here. But the thing to watch out for is that there's a line between a management information system and an individual employee and management sort of feedback system. And so the other piece of the 5 practices, that frontline self-sufficiency, where we cross task type, is we need our frontline to know how they're doing, irrespective and independently of the management information systems that are tracking them. And in the age of big data, this is getting to be a lost truth, but it's super important. If you are that IT guy, if you work at that desk and you've got your 3 issue queues, then there's a difference between you having your 3 issue queues on Post-it notes at your desk and you knowing how you're doing versus your manager tracking you through some central insight system and giving you a rating. And the simplest way to talk about that difference is, are you telling your manager how it's going, or is your manager telling you how it's going? And although we have a lot more data management systems, we have not yet crafted the system where the manager knows better what's going on than the person actually doing the work. So we need upward communication. And so, management information systems are fine. We want to track all that stuff. It is actually useful for staffing models. Absolutely. Big business, we got to be smart about this stuff. At the same time, what I'm looking for when I consult with a big organization is, are those people on the ground doing the work? Do they actually know how it's going? Because we need to be asking them. We cannot be looking at the stuff in the model because they're managing the stuff in the model because it affects their lives and they're humans, and they know what they're supposed to hit, and they tend to produce more or less they're supposed to hit. I want to know what they really think is going on next week. Yeah, you're on track. Good. You've met all your goals. What do you see coming? Because that's where you start to hear those conversations about, we're really in trouble here, over the water cooler kind of thing. We need that to reflect in management, and that comes from the intelligence of the people, not from the data in the system.
Oh, that's so funny that you said that, and I started thinking about a conversation that I often get into, with contact centers, and is that people will talk about metrics, and I'm like, I don't care. Tell me what your metric target is, because you know what, I'll meet it. Matter of fact, I'll beat it. How I get there, you don't want to know.
Right. Human beings are sophisticated, and when you put the thing between us and survival, we hit the target, and we do hit the target. But yet we all know they know more. It's down there. It's there somewhere, right? And how do we get that information in? It's also, by the way, better for engagement if you're doing the work and you feel like, hey, they're listening to what I'm saying about the work and they care how I'm doing, as opposed to they've imposed some draconian tracking on me and my job is to hit the target, right? So it is better for the individuals as well.
Oh, most definitely. So when you start talking about the upward feedback and self-sufficiency, and that's what the chapter that you closed the book in, and I know you had mentioned something about how some of these things are independent, they overlap. All of these relational type of aspects. But for me, when you start looking at these 5 key management components, where do you often see that most organizations need essentially that support and bolstering and that guidance because they're just way off?
It's funny. It moves around. It's easy to tell a story, and I'm sure everyone can relate to a story of the organization that's having real trouble with group decision making. Right? We get together, and then it's either whoever yells the loudest, or it's half the people aren't even engaged, so they don't contribute, or it's factionalized, or it's become politicized. Right? So there's often a lot of work to do around this concept of having a decider, that's what we talk about in group decision making, and then having that decider to learn, not I don't tell my team, convince me. My agreement is off the table. I tell them, teach me, and then I make the best decision I can. So there's work to do there. The forward-looking piece, which kind of crosses over into the output and status broadcasting and as well the work preview meetings. Are your meetings forward-looking? Are you really spending the airtime in the meeting looking at future variants and then talking about what you're going to do about that future variance, as opposed to listening to individual presentations in the narrative about, quote unquote, how it's going, right? What I call the North American management model runs on slideware and talk, right? I'm going to get up for 10 minutes, tell you how it's going, and then my peer will, and by the time your management team is done, we've spent an hour producing a newsletter, and no decisions were made, and the meeting's over, right? So there's a lot there. But equally, to your point, the frontline self-sufficiency, that issue of, is the frontline feeding good information up, or are they managed or over-controlled in such a way that they're feeding up the party line? Yes, we're on track, boss. We're always on track. The answer is always, we're on track, right? That's not useful, right? I mean, the history of failed organizations is just littered with situations where people saw trouble and didn't mention it, right, at all levels. And so that issue of, from the front line, and that crosses over too, that from the front line, it's about foreseeing the work. And then we didn't talk about linked teams yet, but in the issue of linked teams, this idea that, hey, you and I work for a boss, I'm not working my goals at the expense of your goals. We are both held accountable to boss's goals. So if boss's goals don't get hit, then our team has failed and we essentially fail. So yes, I have goals. Yes, you have goals. If I can manage my world and my goals, without problems, that's fine. But as soon as we cross over and we need, Jim and Ed need the same resources, we're going to solve that problem in the context of the higher level. We're not going to fight amongst ourselves. And that's another version of saying, if we see a problem, I don't go, well, that's Jim's problem, I'm not going to help with that. I go, okay, if Jim fails, I fail. How am I going to help, right? And hey, Jim, if you're not asking me for help, maybe I'm coming to you and going, take some help. I don't want to fail, right? So it just reframes that same reptilian brainstem doesn't want to fail. We just redirect it to the failure of the team. And all of that has to do with, avoiding the loss of information and the notion that, we're all going to plug our ears and pretend everything's fine, because that just happens so often in organizations, and it's so detrimental. It's bad for morale. It's bad for engagement. It's bad for finance. I mean, there's no upside to pretending everything's fine when it's not.
Well, and the interesting thing is, you were talking through it, and I'm like, all of this is changeable. It's just, doing a different, behavior and creating a better habit. Okay, so when I start looking at, all of the things that we're talking about here, and these 5 management practices, and all of the the change, the new behaviors, we need a lot of, really energy in order to be able to focus on that. And one of the things that we look at on the show are quotes to help give us a little bit of a focus and a little bit of a energy jolt. Is there a quote or two that you can share?
Well, there's a few at the beginning there's one at the beginning of every chapter in my book. One of my favorites is from my mentor that you mentioned in the introduction, and it's his name is Bill Daniels. He goes by William R. Daniels. The quote is, "You can't bake a pie one slice at a time." And that's the line we advise managers to use their management teams, which is, it's not Jim, bake your slice, Ed, bake your slice. It's Jim, Ed, everybody else, we're baking this pie. And so, if the pie doesn't come out, we didn't do it, right? So that's one of them. The other one, I always misquote this slightly, but the one I use at Output and Status Broadcasting is the Yogi Berra. If you don't know where you're going, you got to be careful because you might not get there. And although, everyone knows goals are important, and what this work has proven is that goals aren't enough, you do have to have that, that few things you're going to measure. The explosion of measurability and metrics and computing power has sort of taken us in a direction where everyone has 400 metrics. And that's proven to be equally detrimental as having none, because we don't know what we're managing to. So we need every manager to have, 3, 5, 7 key things that they're working to deliver that they can talk about and chart and forecast. And once we get to that level, we get that abstraction right, or my things at my level, the next level up, it's the next level of abstraction, right? Get all that together, then that is, a key part of how we have the organization running. So that's just a couple.
Well, and I can only imagine going back from, your childhood, helping your dad, all the way up, going through, Intel, and being that, let's just say, that oddball engineer, is that you probably had a lot of humps that you've had to get over in order to be able to be where you are today in the direction that you're heading. Can you share one of those stories with us?
There have been a couple. One that comes to mind is I had a moment where I was doing I was running kind of an industry forum It was during my time at Semitech. So Semitech would work on these sort of advanced technology things. So we'd get people together that were otherwise competitors, and we'd try and collaborate on these things that were, a couple generations out, because if we didn't, we'd never figure it out, right? So it was sort of a funny dynamic anyway to begin with. You have people in the room that today they're competing fiercely for share, but they're looking, 10 years down the road and going, what are we going to do there? If we don't have some agreements, there's nothing, because technology isn't figured out yet, So it was one of these meetings, and I had gotten a lot of advice about how to run the meeting. It was my meeting to run, and I had gotten advice from technical people and from meeting people. And it's kind of a detailed story, but the point is, I followed all the advice, but I didn't, before I start the meeting, take the time to actually stop and digest and go, what does it all mean to me? What does it mean to sort of this system, how these people are going to interact? And how do I sort of incorporate that all into a specific sort of operationalize, what am I going to do with these people for the next, X number of hours? Should they be together? Should I group them out? Like just really mechanical stuff. And I had all this advice about how to do it, but because I didn't do that, I didn't use my own sort of understanding of how the system had to work. What happened was it kind of went off the rails. I had this big group of people, and there were arguments erupting, and it got kind of messy. Lucky for me, they were professionals, and they recovered, I would say probably more due to their own professionalism than my good guidance. But it is a really intense experience to be running a room full of, I want to say it was upwards of 50 people, and to have it really go off the rails badly, and you're the one who has to fix it, and you don't know how. So after that, first of all, I got better at how. So I went and learned some stuff about how to run the room. But what I really took away from that was, it's not just the individual pieces, it's the system. And it's funny, I hadn't thought about this in a while, but I actually think that's kind of the message of Iterate too, which is, any one of these things, you can go write really good goals. And there's whole books about writing goals. But if you don't incorporate that into how you're running things, it's not enough. You can do really good group decision making. You can study the experts on group decision, and every time you put people together, you can make the perfect decision. But if you're feeding in bad information and you're not talking about the right things, it sort of doesn't matter, right? So it's sort of that higher level, you've got to tie it all together. That, I think, was the message for me in that experience, which was, don't forget to bring your own intelligence to the table, and don't forget to look at the whole instead of just optimizing the parts.
Well, hey, I'm glad you went through that experience, because it allowed you to, create, this book, Iterate, with all the amazing insight that you have in it, and the work that you're still yet to do. And the Fast Leader Legion wishes you the very best. Now, before we move on, let's get a quick word from our sponsor. An Even Better Place to Work is an easy-to-use solution that gives you a continuous diagnostic on employee engagement, along with integrated activities that will improve employee engagement and leadership skills in everyone. Using this award-winning solution is guaranteed to create motivated, productive, and loyal employees who have great work relationships with their colleagues and your customers. To learn more about An Even Better Place to Work, visit beyondmorale.com/better. Okay, Fast Leader Legion, now it's time for the Hump Day Hoedown. Okay, Ed, the Hump Day Hoedown is the part of our show where you give us good insights fast. I'm going to ask you several questions, and your job is to give us robust yet rapid responses that are going to help us move onward and upward faster. Ed Muzio, are you ready to hoedown?
I'm ready.
All right. So what do you think is holding you back from being an even better leader today?
I think there's a couple things there. I think one of them is time. I mean, I have a time problem, and I'm very diligent about cutting out family time, and that's a choice. So I think that's always a challenge for all of us. The other one is I haven't yet cracked the code of how to help people abstract things. And what I mean is, you read the Iterate book, and the first example I give is manufacturing, because I had to give a first example. And so, I did that, and then someone puts the book down and goes, that's not about me. I've had this happen where you go, well, here's an example from finance. They go, well, that's a different industry. Well, here's an example from your industry. And they go, well, that was 2 years ago. And it's like, I don't know how to crack that piece of humanity that wants to just dismiss it. Maybe there's not an answer, but I want to figure that out.
What is the best leadership advice you have ever received?
I had a good friend who told me, when you see things circling the drain, it falls to you to help, not for any ethical reason, but because it'll drive you crazy if you don't. So she was talking about in meetings or in groups. And it's sort of, I think, it's a good piece of advice in terms of that higher level, take responsibility for helping those around you, because you can and because you should, and because if you don't, you're going to suffer with them.
What is one of your secrets that you believe contributes to your success?
I think I believe in boundaries. I think I'm pretty good at that boundary, I guess, between work and family. I get more weekends off than many professionals I know. And I think it contributes to my family's success, but I think it also puts me in the right mind frame at work.
What do you feel is one of your best tools that helps you lead in business or life?
It sounds so boring, but I think my calendar. I have this calendar. I have business processes with my assistant around managing the calendar. We carry multiple air reservations sometimes. I mean, my calendar is a mess. she actually told me she used to support a handful of professionals, and she said my calendar is worse than all of theirs put together. But it makes us optimal. I mean, it really is a key.
And what would be one book you'd recommend to our listeners? It could be from any genre. Of course, we're going to put a link to Iterate on your show notes page as well.
Okay. I hate to pick. I'm always between a business book and a fiction book, but I'll go business book first, which is The Insightful Leader by Carl Ann Ferguson. She does a really good job taking the opposite perspective on the play to your strengths, which is don't overplay to your strengths. And I could say a lot more about it, but it was really helpful for me to realize that, whatever it is, results orientation, personal connection, you can overplay it and do damage as a leader. And she has some really good information about how to continue to play to it, but not to overdo it.
Okay, Fast Leader Legion, you can find links to that and other bonus information from today's show by going to fastleader.net/EdMuzio. Okay, Ed, this is my last Hump Day Hold On question. Imagine you were given the opportunity to go back to the age of 25, and you can take the knowledge and skills that you have now back with you. But you can't take everything back. You can only choose one. So what skill or piece of knowledge would you take back with you, and why?
I think it would be sort of a longer range view. There's the Zen story about the farmer who, the horse runs away and the neighbors say, oh, it's too bad. And he goes, maybe. And the next day the horse brings a second horse back and the neighbors say, what good luck? And he goes, maybe. And the next day the kid breaks his leg trying to train the horse. It just goes on. But there's that concept. The kid version for the 6-year-old is the chutes and ladders game, which is sometimes you go down a really big chute, it feels like you failed, but then you spin the right number and you get to go up an even bigger ladder, right? So I think this idea that, it's the Winston Churchill, success is not final, failure is not fatal. It applies to iteration, but I think it applies to life as well, which is, everything is in the broader context, you don't understand it yet. So don't get too wrapped up around the wins and the losses, just kind of keep taking every step.
Ed, it was an honor to spend time with you today. Can you please share with the Fast Leader Legion how they can connect with you?
Jim, thank you. It's the book is Iterate. The book's website is iteratenow.com. That's where those videos are that you mentioned. There's a few right on the homepage. The rest, you have to register with the book. And then my company is Group Harmonics, and that's groupharmonics.com. So those are all tied together and linked to social media if you're interested.
Ed Muzio, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. The Fast Leader Legion honors you and thanks you for helping us get over the hump. Thank you for joining me on the Fast Leader Show today. For recaps, links from every show, special offers, and access to download and subscribe, if you haven't already, head on over to fastleader.net so we can help you move onward and upward faster.